You wake up to hands on your arms dragging you from a pile of straw that barely qualifies as a bed. It's still dark. The only light is a flickering torch that burns too close to your face. You try to scream, but the moment your mouth opens, a gag gets shoved between your teeth. You're not told why. You're not asked anything. You're not even looked at like a person. You're a sack of suspicion in human form. The cart they throw you into reeks of old sweat, dried blood, and the faint acidic sting of fear left behind by whoever was hauled off last. Your family isn't even there to say goodbye. Not because they don't care, because they've already started pretending they never knew you. That's how it works. In medieval Europe, guilt isn't proven. It's assumed. The moment someone points a finger, the trial has already ended. The rest is theatre. Welcome to the performance. You're the star. And the executioner already knows your lines. But before we plunge into God's justice and the sacred art of legalized agony, do yourself a favor. Subscribe before the Inquisition decides your browsing history is evidence of heresy. Because here's the real secret. Trials in the Middle Ages weren't about truth. They weren't designed to find out what happened. They weren't concerned with fairness, logic, or what you might naively call evidence. No, trials were rituals. Trials were fear. Trials were the medieval equivalent of a morality play, except the actors screamed, bled, and sometimes drowned in full view of their village. Your innocence? That was never the point. Your guilt? That was the default setting. Your pain? That was the proof. Maybe you're accused of theft. Maybe you're accused of heresy. Maybe your neighbor just doesn't like the way you stir your porridge. Doesn't matter. The accusation is enough. And suddenly, the church bells toll not for prayer, but for punishment. You don't get a lawyer. You don't get a trial date. You get dragged to the town square and chained to a post while your accuser, who may or may not be sober, spins a tale of your moral rot to a group of men who believe left-handedness is suspicious and sneezing could be demonic possession. You want a jury? Sure. 12 locals who can't read, have never traveled more than 5 miles from their birthplace, and just want to get back to their fields before it rains. They're not listening. They're looking at your shoes. Are they too nice for a peasant? Are they too worn for a craftsman? Do you look nervous? That's guilt. Too calm? That's guilt too. Your fate may be decided by something called trial by ordeal, which is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Let's start with the hot water test. A priest drops a stone into a cauldron of boiling water. You have to reach in and grab it. If your arm heals within 3 days without signs of infection, you're innocent. If not, surprise, you're not only guilty, but now you're guilty and burned. There's also the cold water test. They tie your hands and feet, toss you in a river, and watch. If you sink, congrats, you're innocent, and probably dead. If you float, you're guilty. Why? Because water is pure, and it rejects the guilty. Yes, the river hates you. So now you're guilty and wet, and people are already arguing about who gets your goat. If you're lucky, your trial involves oaths and compurgators. That means you swear you didn't do it, and then find a dozen people to swear they believe you. Not that they saw anything, not that they know anything, just that they believe you. If you're a noble, you probably get off. If you're a peasant, those 12 people aren't showing up. Not because they think you're guilty, because they don't want the church to start asking questions about them. Because in medieval Europe, proximity to the accused is contagious. Truth isn't viral. Guilt is. And then there's trial by combat. You can demand to fight your accuser. Except maybe your accuser is a professional knight with a mace and a family crest. And you? You've got a limp and a pitchfork. Doesn't matter. God will grant victory to the innocent, right? Except when he doesn't. Except when you die gurgling on your own teeth while the crowd cheers. The lesson? God wanted you dead. Or he blinked. Either way, you're buried under a marker that just says, probably guilty. But let's say it's worse. Let's say you're accused of heresy. That's not just a crime. That's a spiritual infection. The church doesn't care about your body. It cares about your soul. And that's why it's about to torture. Both. Enter the inquisitors. Robes. Candles. Latin. Chains. Welcome to a sacred interrogation, where your screams are hymns and your confession is predestined. You'll be stretched until your joints pop, pressed until your ribs crack, starved, humiliated, deprived of sleep, light, and the luxury of believing in mercy. And if you confess, good. You'll be forgiven. Then executed. If you don't confess, that's fine. The pain continues. And if you die without admitting guilt, your corpse is still burned, because refusal to confess is obviously proof of guilt. You lose either way. God's will is mysterious, but your sentence is not. Witnesses? Sure. Bring them. Bring pigs. No, seriously. In some cases, animals stood trial. A pig that bit a child. A rooster that laid an egg. All subject to the same rules as humans, which tells you exactly how much your life is worth. Evidence? Maybe a birthmark. Maybe a missing Bible. Maybe a weird dream someone had. That's all it takes. And once the suspicion starts, it doesn't stop. Trials become wildfire. One heretic breeds more. One witch leads to another. You know what the safest verdict in a medieval trial was? Guilty. Because then you're not next. The public, they love it. Trials are entertainment. You're not a citizen. You're a spectacle. Kids watch. Merchants sell bread. And someone's already betting how long it'll take you to scream. Because punishment is a party. Stocks, whippings, brands, mutilation, each a little sermon in flesh. And death, that's the finale. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, always in the square, always before a crowd, always with the unspoken lesson, don't be next. And if by some miracle you're not executed, you're broken, marked, a walking scar. Maybe they branded your face. Maybe they cut off your hand. Maybe they just took everything you owned and called it penance. You're free, technically, but you can't work. You can't marry. You can't beg loud enough to drown the whispers. You are no longer a person. You are a warning. Because justice in the Middle Ages wasn't about what you did. It was about who needed to be blamed, who needed to be silenced, who needed to suffer just enough to make the rest of the village walk a little faster past the church. And make no mistake, nobody really thought the trials were fair. But fairness wasn't the point. Obedience was, order was, fear was. Because a terrified population is easier to preach to, easier to control, easier to rule. So now you're standing in chains. The sentence is read, the crowd watches. You wonder, not if you'll survive, but how long it will take. The flames are being lit. The priest is murmuring a blessing. And you? You have one last thought before the smoke fills your lungs. This isn't a trial. This is a sacrifice. So if you think you would have stood a chance in a medieval court, think again. You weren't innocent. You were available. And your pain was the price of peace. Now, before you get accused of heresy for not hitting that like button, go ahead and subscribe. You never know who's watching. It starts with a glance. A whisper, a name said too softly to be official, but loud enough to echo through stone streets and straw-roofed homes. You don't hear the accusation first. You feel it. The silence when you walk into a room. The prayers that stop when you pass. The eyes that won't meet yours because they're afraid guilt is catching. And in the Middle Ages, it might as well be. Because being accused of a crime back then didn't mean someone thought you were guilty. It meant they decided you were. And the only question left was what kind of spectacle your guilt would become. You don't get a moment to explain. You don't get a hearing. You don't even get a list of charges. What you get is the feeling that the sky has cracked open and the whole village is watching to see what crawls out. Because anyone could accuse anyone. That's the horror of it. Your neighbor who wants your plot of land. The butcher whose pig wandered into your garden. The priest who thinks you looked too skeptical during the sermon. The child who had a nightmare and woke up convinced you cursed their dreams. Doesn't matter who, doesn't matter why. Once the accusation is spoken aloud, it becomes fact. Truth doesn't enter the room. It's too afraid to show up. Because in this world, truth isn't decided by evidence. It's decided by fire. There is no presumption of innocence. That's a modern luxury. In the medieval mind, if someone accuses you, that means God has allowed it. And if God allows it, there must be something wrong with you. The accusation is the sentence. The rest is paperwork. Or worse, ritual. Because now the fire is lit, and it's not symbolic. It's real, it's warm, it's waiting. Maybe it's not flames. Maybe it's water. Maybe it's rope. But the outcome is the same. You are the offering. The village needs someone to bleed so they can feel safe again. And today, your blood is the safest bet. What was the crime? Depends on who's asking. Maybe someone says you stole a loaf of bread. Maybe they say you whispered the devil's name into a stream. Maybe they just don't like the way your dog looked at them. The medieval legal system didn't require facts. It fed on stories, dreams, gut feelings. Heard you talking to yourself near the well? Could be prayer. Could be witchcraft. Did your cow die after the blacksmith saw you frown? That's suspicious. Did your neighbor stub his toe and remember that you once forgot to smile at his wife? That's basically a signed confession. In a time where most people couldn't read, and even fewer could explain what law meant, justice was shaped by rumor. A whisper could become a trial. A sneeze could become a sermon. A grudge could become a gallows. And here does the twist. The poor suffered her more, but the rich played better. If you were a peasant, your best defense was begging. If you were a noble, your best defense was bribery. The same crime, say, speaking against the church, could earn one mon a scolding and another a scaffold. Because class wasn't just a matter of money. It was a matter of survival. The higher your birth, the less your feet touched the fire. The lower your station, the closer you lived to the edge of accusation. The poor couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't pay tithes. They couldn't offer gold or goats to smooth things over. They couldn't even flee, because if you ran, you were guilty. And if you stayed, you were guilty. The trap was already shut, and you were never the one holding the key. Worse still, there were no rules about who could accuse. Children were taken seriously. Animals, in some bizarre cases, even more so. Dreams were evidence. Hallucinations were divine messages. A fevered rant from a drunk monk could condemn you faster than any eyewitness. And once your name was out there, it didn't matter how long you'd been a good Christian, a kind neighbor, a loyal worker. People don't remember your life. They remember the rumor. You are no longer Anna the baker. You are Anna the accused. Anna the witch. Anna the widow whose husband died too conveniently. You are a character in a morality play you didn't audition for, and the script ends in fire. And that's how personal vengeance became public justice. Feuds between families turned into trials. Disputes over property turned into executions. The moment someone wanted you gone, the system became their weapon. They didn't need proof. They just needed fear. And fear was always in stock. You wronged someone 5 years ago. Doesn't matter. They waited. And now they speak your name before the church, and suddenly your entire world shrinks to the space between your knees and the chopping block. Forgiveness was never the goal. Finality was. Maybe you try to fight it. Maybe you beg for a chance to explain. But now your desperation is more evidence. Why are you sweating? Why do you look afraid? What do you have to hide? In a world built on suspicion, even your innocence is suspicious. If you act calm, you're cold-hearted. If you cry, you're hysterical. If you say nothing, you're obviously trying to hide something. No reaction is the right one. No defense is enough. Because you were never on trial, the idea of you was. This wasn't about crime. This was about cleansing. The village needs to feel safe. The Lord needs to feel powerful. The priest needs to feel righteous. And you? You're the price of those feelings. So you're dragged into a square. Your neighbors watch. Some cry. Most don't. Some remember the time you helped them carry water or gave them your last crust of bread. And still they stay silent. Because if they speak, they become you. And no one wants to be you. Not today. So you kneel. And the man with the scroll reads out the charges. Some are real. Most aren't. It doesn't matter. The ink is dry. The sentence is written. And as the fire crackles, or the axe lifts, or the rope tightens, the only thing you understand is this. You were guilty the moment someone decided you were. Everything after that was just a ceremony, a play for the crowd, a script you didn't get to read. And no one ever claps at the end. So next time you think history is dry or distant, remember this. All it took was a word. And that word could be your name. Because in the Middle Ages, guilt came first. Reasons came later. And justice was just another name for revenge. You stand in the middle of the room and realize it's not a courtroom. It's a theater. There's a stage made of dirt and splinters. There's an audience. Peasants, merchants, guards, children, priests. There's a script, but you didn't write it. You didn't even read it. Because in this version of justice, the only role you get to play is the villain. And the ending? Already decided. You're not here to be heard. You're here to be condemned. Welcome to medieval court, where there are no lawyers, no protections, no rights, just decisions dressed up as rituals, and pain paraded as righteousness. You stand alone. No one stands with you. And the men who will judge you? They've already leaned toward the fire. The judge might be a priest with blood under his fingernails from yesterday's confession, or a soldier who's never put down a sword long enough to hold a book, or a landowner who still remembers the time you stepped too close to his fence. It doesn't matter who he is. He wears authority like a cloak, and it's woven from arrogance, ignorance, and fear. He might not be able to read. He might not be able to write. But he can sentence you. and that's all the job requires. The court is held in a church, a hall, a barn, or the open air, because formality isn't the point. The point is that people see it, because this isn't just about your guilt, it's about their obedience. This trial is not for justice, it's for example. So the bell rings, the crowd gathers, children sit on shoulders, mothers hold infants, men pass bread, all waiting to see if today ends in fire, rope, or forgiveness, so rare it's practically superstition. And then they bring you forward. Your wrists are bound, your clothes are torn, you haven't slept in days. But no one sees your suffering. They see the smoke rising in the distance and hope it's not theirs tomorrow. You try to speak, but the air thickens in your throat. Because here's the first rule of medieval court. You don't talk unless spoken to. And even when you're allowed to speak, you don't say too much. Silence is suspicious. But so is confidence. Measured words sound rehearsed. Emotion sounds guilty. There is no safe tone. There is no safe face. You are not trying to prove your innocence. You are trying to avoid looking too guilty while proving you don't deserve to die yet. You hear words you don't understand. Latin phrases slither around you like snakes. The court speaks in tongues not meant for you, because you, like most people, don't speak Latin. You speak the language of the field, the forge, the hearth. But justice is spoken in Latin. Punishment is spoken in action. The sentence is hidden in syllables you'll never decode. And by the time you realize they've finished reading it, someone's already lighting the torches. There is no defense, no advocate, no cross-examination, no jury of peers. If you're lucky, you can call on oath helpers, people who swear you're a good person. But they have to be willing to stand beside you. And in a world where standing beside someone might get you tied to them at the stake, most people step back, fast. No one wants to be next. So you stand alone, while your accuser, your judge, and your executioner all share glances and speak a language that locks you out. And the crowd just watches. Some cheer, some pray, some just stare like they're trying to memorize your face so they can forget it faster. You might be asked to confess, not to clear your name, but to make the paperwork cleaner. A confession smooths the process. It satisfies the audience. It spares the court from pretending longer than it has to. If you refuse, they'll take it from you. Through pain, through fire, through the removal of fingernails and application of iron tools, so twisted you'd swear they were invented by someone who failed at poetry and found solace in cruelty. And if you confess under torture, no one will question the validity of your words. Because if the devil can possess your soul, he can possess your voice too, so either way they win. You speak, guilty. You scream, guilty. You stay silent, guilty. And then comes the reading of the verdict. But you already know what it is. You knew the moment they dragged you here. This isn't a place of weighing truths. This is a place of handing out endings. The scroll is read. The judge doesn't look at you. He looks at the audience. Because this isn't a sentence. It's a sermon. And your body is the punctuation. Sometimes the punishment is death. Sometimes it's mutilation. Sometimes it's exile. And sometimes it's mercy. If you can call being branded, publicly whipped, and forbidden from speaking in public ever again mercy. But what it never is fair. Because fairness requires balance. Fairness requires patience. Fairness requires the belief that you might be right. This court, It requires none of those things. It requires only power. Power to accuse. Power to condemn. Power to silence. And power to do it all in front of the people, so they never forget who holds the torch. And when it's over, the crowd goes home. The children ask questions. The adults give half-truths. The priest thanks God. The judge returns to his meal. You are led away, or carried, or buried, and your name fades from records that were never meant to honor it. The court forgets you. The crowd forgets you. But the ground remembers. Because in the Middle Ages, the court was not where you went to find justice. It was where justice went to die. Screaming, in chains, and usually on fire, you are standing barefoot on the edge of a stone platform, arms bound, breath fogging the cold morning air, and somewhere in front of you is a priest holding a relic, a crowd whispering your name, like it's already carved into a tombstone, and a pit of glowing coals radiating heat that feels personal. This is not punishment. This is not after the verdict. This is the trial. This is the test. And it has nothing to do with what you did. It has everything to do with whether your skin survives long enough to convince a group of illiterate peasants and half-drunk officials that God thinks you're innocent. Welcome to trial by ordeal, where the only real law is pain, and justice is measured in screams, scars, and smoke. In a world where courts were superstition in robes and innocence was a liability, trial by ordeal was seen as divine arbitration. The logic, if you can call it that, went like this. God knows the truth. God protects the innocent. Therefore, if you suffer in this test and survive, you must be guilty because God didn't save you. And if you don't survive, well, that's unfortunate, but clearly you were righteous, and now your soul can rest in peace. Congratulations, you're vindicated. And dead. Either way, someone leaves satisfied. Spoiler, not you. Let's talk about trial by fire, one of the classics. Your hand is plunged into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Or you hold a red-hot iron bar and walk several paces with it, while priests chant and peasants stare. Then your hand is wrapped in cloth for 3 days. If the wound festers, you're guilty. If it miraculously heals without infection, you're innocent. But don't celebrate. You're still disfigured. You might still be punished. Because surviving doesn't prove you're innocent. It just proves you're lucky. Or, in their eyes, lucky enough to not be burned to ash. But luck isn't justice. It's just fire without apology. Then there's trial by water. Cold water, to be precise. Your limbs are bound, and you're tossed into a river like an unwanted sack of grain. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent. Yes, that's the standard. Floating meant you were rejecting the purity of water, sign of evil. Sinking meant the water had accepted you, sign of virtue. Never mind that people float naturally. Never mind that the ropes around your arms and ankles made it hard to do anything but drown, because death was just another form of confirmation. Your corpse was now evidence, and no one questions a corpse. Some ordeals were more specific. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to walk a barefoot path of glowing plowshares while holding a crucifix. If she completed it without crying out or collapsing, she was considered faithful. Others involved placing an accused person's arm in a cauldron of boiling oil or holding their tongue with heated tongs. One man was ordered to lift a red-hot horseshoe and walk with it, and when his hand turned black and peeled in sheets, the crowd took it as divine wisdom. Because in this system, pain wasn't a flaw, It was the feature. Suffering wasn't the consequence, it was the process. Every blister, every welt, every shriek rising through the square was a sacred message. That was the logic. Pain equals proof. Survival equals shame. Death equals purity. Nothing in between. And don't make the mistake of thinking these were isolated incidents. These were frequent. These were public. These were endorsed. Entire villages would turn out to watch. Children on shoulders, merchants selling pies, elders clutching beads, everyone waiting for the moment when heat met flesh, when bone met stone, when silence cracked into screams. These weren't private trials behind closed doors. They were events, rituals, theatre with blood instead of curtains. The church stood behind them. The nobles approved them. The crowd needed them. Because fear doesn't enforce itself. It needs demonstrations. And trial by ordeal was one hell of a demonstration. Even the preparation was ceremonial. Before the iron was heated, before the water boiled, there was prayer. Always prayer. Priests would bless the tools of torment, reciting verses and invoking God's will over a cauldron hot enough to cook limbs. They weren't torturing you. They were cleansing you, helping the truth emerge through fire. The scar would speak for you. Your body became your testimony, and no one could cross-examine pain. And yet no matter how many hands blistered, how many lungs filled with river water, how many feet sizzled on plowshares, they kept believing. Because belief wasn't about truth. It was about order. These ordeals didn't search for justice. They enforced control. Accusation led to pain. Pain led to silence. And silence, in a world ruled by whispers and fear, was the most valuable currency of all. People didn't speak out after an ordeal. They didn't question authority. They didn't point fingers at the wrong person. Because they'd seen what happened when the fire chose you. But sometimes the fire didn't kill. Sometimes the wounds healed, slowly, miraculously, and the crowd would shift, uncomfortable. Murmurs would begin. Maybe the accused wasn't guilty. Maybe God did intervene. But then what? Now the village has to live with the idea that they nearly burned an innocent man. So they shift again. They reinterpret. He may be innocent in this case, but he's still suspicious. The wounds healed, yes, but look at his eyes. Too calm. Maybe the devil is protecting him. Because the system couldn't be wrong. That would mean the priests were wrong. The lords were wrong. The whole charade was built on nothing but ash and prayer smoke. And that couldn't be. So they moved on. Found a new accused. Lit a new fire. And through it all, people still believed. Believed in the fire. Believed in the river. Believed in the boiling iron and the scalding water. Because the alternative, the idea that these ordeals were barbaric, arbitrary and cruel, was too terrifying. If pain didn't reveal the truth, then what did? If survival wasn't proof of guilt, then how could anyone know anything? So they clung to the fire, not because it was right, but because it was predictable, reliable, final. So next time you hear the phrase, trial by fire, remember it wasn't a metaphor. It was a sentence. It was a stage. It was the belief that justice came through flame and steel and water so cold it stopped your heart. And it was the hope, desperate, misplaced and deadly, that somewhere in the heat God was watching. Spoiler, if he was, he wasn't intervening. They called it investigation, not punishment, not vengeance, not even justice. Just a method, just a process, just a way to find the truth. But in the Middle Ages, truth had nothing to do with reality. It had everything to do with submission, with silence, with the moment your body gave out before your mind. Torture wasn't about proving anything. It was about breaking everything: bones, spirit, identity, will. You weren't interrogated to discover facts. You were tortured until you gave the answer they wanted. And if you didn't know the answer, you made one up. Anything to make the pain stop. And the moment you spoke, that was it. Confession. Case closed. Trial over. Sentence delivered. Because once your screams filled the room, the court called it justice. The tools were many, the principles few. Pain equals truth. Terror equals clarity. If you confess, you must be guilty. If you don't, you're lying, or possessed, or cursed, or all three. And if you pass out before you confess, well, they'll wake you up. Because sleep is not a right. Rest is not a mercy. They don't want your comfort. They want your confession. And they'll pull it out of your throat like weeds from dry soil. Slow, brutal, inevitable. The rack was a favorite. A wooden frame, a crank, a system of pulleys and ropes. Your hands tied at one end, your ankles at the other. They turn the wheel and your body stretches. First the joints ache, then they separate. Tendons snap, shoulders dislocate, hips tear. You start screaming early, and you don't stop, because every inch of your being is telling you that this is the end. But it's not. Not yet. Because as long as you're conscious, they'll keep going. Tell us the truth, they say. But what they mean is, give us something we can use. Say you were meeting with the devil. Say you were at the Sabbath. Say you poisoned the well. Say you kissed the mark on your back that wasn't there before they tied you up. Say anything. And if you do, they call it justice. If you don't, they keep turning the wheel. The thumbscrew was smaller, but no less horrifying. Your fingers placed between metal jaws. A screw turned slowly. Flesh compresses, nails crack, bones splinter. Pain floods your nerves like boiling oil. You can't run. You can't pull away. All you can do is scream until you can't anymore. Until the words, "I did it," come out, even if you don't know what it is. They'll fill in the rest. Then there's water torture. A cloth over the face. A pitcher poured slowly. Your mouth, your nose, your lungs fill with the idea of drowning. It's not that you can't breathe. It's that your body believes it's dying. You gasp, you choke, you panic. And that's when they ask the questions, between coughs, between gurgles, between sobs. And when you beg them to stop, they ask again. Confess. That word becomes salvation. Not because it saves your soul, but because it might save your life, or at least let you breathe again. And even if it doesn't, even if they keep going, it's the only power you have left. The power to agree. Sleep deprivation? Also legal. They keep you awake for days. No darkens, no silence. Just voices, firelight, and footsteps. Always footsteps. You lose track of time, of your name, of what you did or didn't do. You start to believe them. Maybe you are guilty. Maybe you did curse that child. Maybe you were at that place you've never been. Because when your body collapses, your mind follows. And they're waiting at the bottom. Fake executions, routine. They drag you to the edge of death. A noose, a blade, a pit. They say, "This is it." And right when your bowels give out, they stop. Smile, walk away. You just died without dying. And now everything you say afterward. That's not testimony. That's survival instinct. And that's what they want. They don't need proof. They need you to play the part. Confess. and they can parade you through the village as another soul saved through righteous pain, and always, always, the judge must approve it. But here's the secret. They always approved. Because torture was not rogue violence. It was institutional, organized, sacred, blessed by priests, overseen by scribes, written down in ledgers with dates and times and signatures. Torture wasn't an accident. It was a procedure, a routine part of justice, like boiling water for tea, like sharpening knives before the feast. But it wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional. You were isolated, dehumanized, stripped naked, chained in darkness, left in cells where rats whispered, and your own breath became the only sound you recognized. You were kept in filth, fed just enough to stay alive, told just enough to believe there was still hope, and then dragged back to the chamber when they needed a name. Any name. Yours, your neighbor's, a stranger's, the devil's. And when it was over, you were either dead, broken, or sentenced. Sometimes all three. Your body never healed right. Your mind never did either. If you confessed, you were punished. If you didn't, you were punished harder. And if they let you go, it wasn't because they believed you. It was because they had what they needed. A story, a signature, a scapegoat. Because in the Middle Ages, truth was not found. It was forced, dragged from the body like a demon from the mouth. And the screams were not the sound of guilt. They were the sound of justice, echoing through stone halls and cold chapels, sanctified by ritual and sealed with blood. So if you ever wonder what it meant to prove something in a world ruled by fear, remember this. They didn't want truth. They wanted obedience, and they found it in screams you already knew. Long before the sentence was spoken, long before the parchment was unrolled, long before the crowd arrived in the square like flies to blood, you knew how it would end. Because sentencing in the Middle Ages wasn't about decision. It was about delivery. It was a script, a ritual, a rehearsed finale where everyone knew their lines except the condemned. The judge didn't deliberate. The priest didn't pray for mercy. The people didn't hope for clemency. The sentence wasn't a surprise. It was a formality. And the courtroom wasn't a chamber of justice. It was a stage for tragedy. The announcement was public, always public, because justice didn't count unless people watched. The court didn't whisper its verdicts behind closed doors. It shouted them into the wind. The town square became the theater. The steps of the church became the pulpit of punishment. Children clung to their mothers. Merchants paused their deals. Farmers left their tools in the fields. Everyone came to see the sentence, because that was the point. Justice wasn't just done. It had to be seen. Pain, after all, is only useful when it teaches a lesson, and the lesson needed an audience. The judge would rise. The scroll would be read. The sentence spoken in the same tone you use to list the ingredients of a stew. Cold, flat, final. Maybe it was exile, a banishment, a forced erasure from the village's memory. You'd be marched to the edge of town, warned never to return, stripped of your belongings, and spat into the wilderness to starve among the wolves and bandits. But exile wasn't mercy. It was slow death outside the walls, a prolonged ending, invisible to the crowd, but no less brutal. Maybe it was branding, a hot iron pressed into your flesh, burning your crime into your skin forever. A mark on your face, your shoulder, your hand. Now, even if you survived, even if you changed, even if you fled, The world would still read your sentence every time they looked at you. You weren't a man anymore. You were a warning or mutilation. Fingers removed, ears cut off, tongue sliced, eyes gouged, each punishment matched to the crime by logic, so twisted it became theatre. Steal something? Lose a hand? Speak against the church? Lose your tongue? Look at someone you shouldn't? Lose your sight? The punishment wasn't about crime. It was about transformation, about turning the body into a living confession, a walking cautionary tale. The message wasn't, "Don't do this." It was, "Look what happens when you do." And then there was death, the great finale, hanging, beheading, burning, the three chords of the medieval requiem. Hanging was simple, brutal, deliberate, a rope, a drop, a crowd holding its breath. If the rope was too short, you strangled slowly. If it was too long, your head might rip from your spine. Either way, the silence that followed was the proof that justice had been served. Beheading was cleaner if the executioner was skilled. One blow, maybe two, maybe three, and the crowd would flinch, not out of pity, but out of impatience. Burning was theatrical. Fire piled high, wood soaked in oil, the condemned tied upright, forced to speak final words no one would remember. Flames were not just for punishment, they were for purification. Your soul cleansed by agony, your body turned into a sermon. But why all this? Why the spectacle? Because the purpose wasn't correction. It wasn't reform. No one expected you to come back changed. No one expected you to come back at all. This wasn't justice. This was a message, a warning, a ritualized reminder of who held the power and what happened to those who didn't bow quickly enough. Your pain wasn't a byproduct. It was the product. Fear was the goal, and it worked. The sentence wasn't supposed to redeem. It was supposed to scare. Not just you, but everyone watching. The blacksmith's apprentice, the widow's son, the baker's daughter. All of them needed to see it, needed to remember it, needed to carry that image with them into their beds and into their prayers, because nothing controls a village like a well-timed execution, and nothing binds a society together like the shared horror of someone else's fall. And the final moment, oh, the final moment was as structured as a mass. The crowd hushed. The executioner adjusted his grip. The judge gave a nod. The priest murmured Latin. The condemned, if they could still speak, were allowed a few last words. Sometimes they begged. Sometimes they cursed. Sometimes they said nothing at all. A drum might roll. A bell might toll. And then the moment came. The axe fell. The rope snapped. The torch touched the pyre. And the sentence became history. What followed was silence, not out of respect, out of necessity. Because once the sentence was carried out, no one wanted to linger. The smell of blood, the crackle of fire, the sudden slackness of a once living body. It was too much, even for those who demanded it. The crowd dispersed. The square was swept. The blood dried. And the next day, the market opened like nothing had happened. But it had. It always had. Because sentences were not forgotten. They echoed, in nightmares, in whispers, in the eyes of the children who saw too much too young, in the trembling hands of the accused who waited their turn, in the sermons that reminded the village what would happen if they stepped out of line. Because in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't blind. It was staged. It wasn't about finding the truth. It was about keeping the peace. And peace was maintained through fire, through blood, through public agony. The sentence was never a conclusion. It was a performance a finale written long before the curtains ever rose. And your last breath was just another line in the script. You thought you were on trial for what you said, for what you believed, for what you practiced in the dark or whispered in the fields. But this wasn't about belief. This wasn't about theology or doctrine or dogma. This was about obedience. This was about fear. This was about making sure the village slept with its mouth shut and its head bowed. Because when the trial involved religion, justice vanished entirely. There were no arguments, no reasoning, no mercy, only fire, only silence, only the ritual of cleansing through destruction. Because when heresy or witchcraft was spoken aloud, the question was no longer if you were guilty. It was how loud you would scream before you burned. Heresy wasn't about what God thought. It was about what the church feared. A single sentence could be enough. A hesitation during prayer. A skipped mass. A question too bold about why the grain rotted or why the priest drank so heavily. The boundaries of heresy moved constantly, because that was the point. If no one knew what would get them killed, then everyone behaved like they were already guilty. And the church? It fed on that fear. It weaponized it. It called it purity. But it was a war, not against evil, but against dissent. And if heresy made you a target, witchcraft made you a symbol. Witch trials were not about discovering witches. They were about explaining disaster. A bad harvest must be the old woman by the woods. A child falls ill must be the midwife with the bitter herbs. A storm ruins the barley crop. Someone must have cursed the sky, because medieval minds feared what they couldn't explain, and the church made sure they blamed what it couldn't control. Witchcraft became the name for everything that frightened people, everything strange, everything female, and once it had a name, it had a face. Yours. The evidence. Pathetic. A mole on your back. A dream someone had about you. The way your cat stared too long at a crucifix. The way milk soured in your bucket. The way lightning struck too near your door. And worse, confessions that came from fear, from torture, from sleep-deprived desperation, or from children, trained, pushed, manipulated, told that dreams were memory, that fantasy was truth, that the neighbor who gave them soup was in league with the devil, and once a child pointed a finger, that was enough. Their innocence gave weight to the lie, and their lie lit fires. Women became the perfect targets, especially the old, the lonely, the skilled, widows without a husband to defend them, healers who used herbs instead of prayer, midwives who saw life and death too closely. These women knew things. They had knowledge outside the church, outside male control, and knowledge, especially when held by women, was always dangerous. So they were called witches, hags, servants of Satan, not because they were, but because the church needed someone to blame. And burning women was easier than admitting that rot and ruin came from poor planning, cruel landlords, and a God that never answered. The Inquisition rose like a tide, not to find truth, but to erase it, cloaked in robes, armed with scrolls and shackles. Their goal wasn't salvation, it was obedience. Confession was everything, not because it revealed facts, but because it confirmed control. You were made to admit you danced with the devil, even if you didn't dance, that you rode broomsticks, even if you couldn't afford one, that you kissed the mark on your back, even if it was a birthmark, a scar or a bruise from when they first tied you to the rack. Because once you said it, once you gave them the words, they owned you. and everyone else. They came to your village not with mercy, but with fire, with lists, with accusations, with instructions. Someone always accused someone. Neighbors turned on each other. Families split. A father accused to protect a daughter. A friend lied to spare themselves. And the Inquisition listened, smiled, took names, and built pyres. You were questioned in Latin, judged by men you'd never met, found guilty by rules you didn't know existed, and your screams were the last sound before the church bells rang for another prayer. Torture was not forbidden. It was blessed. It was necessary, because heresy, they said, corrupted the soul, and only pain could purify. The rack, the iron, the branding flame, all applied in the name of love. Not your love, not God's love, the church's love for control. You confessed, or you bled, or both, and then you were marched to the square, stripped, chained, displayed, because justice, in the eyes of the church, required witnesses, and those witnesses had to remember. The sentence was always theatrical, a sermon with flames. You weren't executed. You were cleansed, purged, burned for your own good. They placed a crucifix near your face and told you to repent, even as they lit the fire. They claimed to save your soul while destroying your body. And the crowd watched, because they needed to, because fear is most effective when it's shared. And when the fire rose, and the screams began, and the smoke drifted toward heaven, the people told themselves it was necessary, that you were dangerous, that your death was peace. But the truth, the real truth, was that they were afraid of the church, of each other, of a world that made no sense. And when people are afraid, they look for witches. They look for heretics. They look for someone they can burn. So don't be fooled by the robes, by the scripture, by the solemn tones and the chants of mercy. Heresy trials weren't holy. Witch trials weren't sacred. The Inquisition wasn't justice. It was a machine, fed by fear, oiled with blood, designed not to reveal truth, but to erase it, to turn people into examples, to make you grateful it wasn't your name whispered in the dark, because in that world no one was safe. Everyone was one mole, one rumor, one storm away from fire. The Holy War didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in villages, in cellars, in courtrooms, in dreams. And it wasn't a war for souls. It was a war for silence, for obedience, for power. And it was fought not with swords, but with accusations, with torture, with ash. In the stories they told, justice was blind, impartial, pure, a noble figure holding scales and a sword, weighing truth against sin, wielding punishment like divine lightning. But in the real Middle Ages, justice had eyes, and they looked straight at your coin pouch. It had ears, and they listened to whispers passed with gold. It had hands, and they were always open, because justice wasn't divine. It was for sale, and if you couldn't pay, you couldn't plead, you couldn't protest, you couldn't survive. Everything had a price. Mercy, delay, silence, even innocence. Bribe the judge, and suddenly the charges seemed less severe. Bribe the priest, and the sin was absolved. Bribe the executioner, and maybe the axe would be sharp. Maybe the rope would be short. Maybe your death would be fast, because there were two versions of justice. One for those with silver, and one for those with nothing but prayers. And prayers in the medieval justice system bounced off stone walls and died unheard. The wealthy could avoid the dungeon entirely. No rack, no branding, no forced confession through fire and iron. Instead, they negotiated. Deals were struck over goblets of wine. Charges were reduced. Trials were postponed. Juries were influenced. Outcomes were written before the parchment ever saw ink. They could pay for time. Time to prepare. Time to flee. Time to erase evidence and rewrite history with a quill dipped in gold. And if that didn't work, they could simply vanish, off to another town, another lord, another court, where their name didn't stink of scandal yet. And the church wasn't blind either. It saw wealth, it chased it, it courted it. The selling of indulgences became a holy business. Confess your sins, yes, but with a coin. Buy your absolution. Buy it for yourself. Buy it for your dead relatives. Turn damnation into a subscription service. Heaven on layaway. Salvation with receipts. The poor, meanwhile, knelt until their knees bled and still left with nothing but guilt. Because grace cost money, and the church kept the ledger. In the courts, justice was dressed in robes, but under the fabric it was just another merchant. Sentences were flexible. Guilty could mean a fine, a donation, a political favor. Innocent could mean nothing if you lacked friends, status, protection. And the judges? They weren't guardians of the law. They were brokers, negotiators, opportunists, one eye on the accused, one on the coin. The verdict wasn't a judgment. It was a transaction. The courtroom wasn't sacred. It was a marketplace. And the poor weren't clients. They were stock, sold, spent, forgotten, and so silence became survival. Speaking out meant drawing attention. Accusing the wrong person meant being accused yourself. Naming corruption meant becoming its next victim. People watched their neighbors hang for crimes they didn't commit and said nothing. They watched the rich ride past the pyres and said nothing, because to speak was to risk, and to risk was to lose. So they bowed, they prayed, they swallowed their rage, and they thanked God it wasn't them this time. But the fear grew, it spread, because when everyone knows that guilt can be erased and truth can be buried under coins, there's no trust left. Only dread. Only the knowledge that justice is not a balance. It's a scale tilted by wealth, and no amount of innocence can tip it back. Justice was not broken in the Middle Ages. It was built that way, built to protect the powerful, built to punish the vulnerable, built to function not as a shield, but as a sword. And the people who held that sword didn't wear armor. They wore robes. They wore crosses. They wore rings heavy with the weight of other people's suffering. And they smiled because they knew the system worked. For them. And for the poor. There was no appeal. No higher court. No mercy hidden in some future reform. Only fear. The kind that infects everything. That chokes conversations. That silences entire generations. That turns villages into shadows and hope into heresy. Justice was not justice. It was theatre. And the ticket price was always more than most could pay. You think you know what a trial looks like. A judge, a defendant, maybe a jury, laws read, evidence presented, a decision based on reason. But what if we told you that in the Middle Ages, the courtroom wasn't just a place of injustice? It was a circus, a stage so warped, so surreal, that it feels more like a fever dream than legal history. You want absurdity? Welcome to a world where pigs were put on trial for murder, where corpses were exhumed to be judged, where effigies were found guilty and punished in place of men too cowardly or too dead to stand in court. This wasn't just injustice. This was institutionalized madness, dressed in robes and draped in ritual, all stamped with the seal of law. Let's begin with the pigs. Yes, pigs. Actual animals hauled into courtrooms, placed in chains, tried for crimes like attacking children, trampling crops, or blaspheming. Whatever that even means when your entire vocabulary consists of squeals. These weren't jokes. These were formal proceedings. A judge, a scribe, a public. The pig might be dressed in human clothes. It might have a lawyer. It might be sentenced to death by hanging, just like a man. And the worst part? It wasn't rare. Villagers took this seriously, because in a world where divine order was everything, no act, no matter how animal, could go unpunished. If a creature violated the cosmic hierarchy, it had to pay, even if it didn't know it was part of the system to begin with. But it didn't stop with animals. Sometimes the dead were the ones put on trial. Picture this. A pope orders the corpse of his predecessor exhumed. Dressed in robes, propped up in court, tried for corruption. A corpse with rotting skin on a throne as a trial proceeds like nothing is wrong. A deacon stands in as the voice of the deceased, answering charges for a man who'd been buried for months. And when the verdict is announced, guilty of course, the body is stripped, mutilated, thrown into a river. That happened. That was law. That was justice. Posthumous sentencing, as if condemnation after death could rewrite the living order, as if shaming a body could somehow restore balance. Other times the accused didn't even bother to show up, because they couldn't, because they were far away, or in hiding, or simply uninterested in pretending the court meant anything real. And so the trial went on anyway, with an effigy, a dummy, a wooden figure dressed in robes, or armor, or even a paper mask of the accused's face. This stand-in would be judged, sentenced, even symbolically executed, burned, hung, displayed. And that was supposed to count. That was supposed to mean something. Because medieval law wasn't always about results. It was about ritual. The form had to be followed, even if the substance was missing entirely. And then there were the show trials, the ones staged not for justice, but for spectacle, to entertain a visiting noble, to distract the townspeople, to prove that law existed even when chaos ruled. These weren't real trials, they were performances, carefully orchestrated dramas where the outcome was predetermined. The accused was doomed, and the audience got to cheer or jeer or cry on cue. A man might be accused of sorcery, simply because a visiting bishop needed to see that the town was pious. A woman might be paraded in chains, not because she was dangerous, but because the king wanted a demonstration of local justice. These trials didn't seek truth, they sought applause. Absurdity was the system. There were trials where insects were charged with eating crops and excommunicated by the church, where frogs were told to leave a village under threat of divine wrath, where locusts were summoned to appear before clergy to defend their actions, where judges held serious discussions about the criminal intent of rodents, because everything had to be part of the moral order. Everything had to obey. And if something disobeyed, no matter how small, how mindless, how natural, it was dragged into the theatre of justice and forced to kneel before the absurd. And it's not that people didn't see the madness. Many did. But to question the court was to question God, to question authority, to question the very idea of law as divine structure. So they laughed in secret. They whispered. They rolled their eyes behind the executioner's back. But publicly, they clapped. They cheered. They acted like it mattered, because it was safer to pretend that justice made sense than to admit the whole world was ruled by chaos in robes. So now we ask you, does this sound like justice or satire? Does this sound like order or delusion? A pig in chains, a corpse on trial, a dummy being burned while a priest prays over it. This isn't fiction. This isn't parody. This is history. This is the world as it was, not as it should have been. And if that doesn't terrify you, then ask yourself what rituals we perform today that future generations will shake their heads at, laughing through clenched teeth, wondering how we ever let it get that far. Because madness in a courtroom doesn't stop being madness just because it's written down, just because it's ritualized, just because people pretend it means something. Madness in a robe is still madness, and justice without reason is just theater in flames. You survived. Somehow. Maybe the ropes didn't bite deep enough. Maybe the fire wasn't lit. Maybe the priest had a soft spot for your family name. Maybe the judge was distracted or bribed or too tired to care that day. Maybe someone important whispered a word in your favor. Or maybe, just maybe, there wasn't enough evidence to condemn you. You were acquitted, cleared, released, alive. But don't mistake that for freedom, because in the Middle Ages, surviving a trial didn't mean escaping its punishment. It only meant you got to walk away from the scaffold. Everything else stayed behind. Your dignity, your future, your peace. Your body carries the marks. A twisted shoulder from the rack, burned flesh from the ordeal, eyes that flinch at sudden light, a back that won't bend the way it used to. You walk different now. You breathe different. You sleep with your teeth clenched and your hands balled into fists. Pain follows you like a shadow, a slow ache that never lets you forget where you've been. And the villagers? They don't forget either. They say nothing to your face. Not anymore. But their silence is heavy. Their eyes avoid yours. Their conversations pause when you pass. They smile, tight-lipped and shallow, as if kindness might be mistaken for conspiracy. You go to the well, and the women draw their buckets a little faster. You walk into the market, and the chatter drops to a hush. You leave, and it starts again. Because even if the court let you go, the people won't. In their minds, the smoke never fully cleared, and suspicion, once lit, burns longer than fire. Your family bears the weight. Your children, if you have them, are now the son or daughter of the accused. Your spouse, if they stayed, carries your shame like a second cloak. Your siblings speak your name softly, if at all. Your land, if it wasn't seized, lies half-tended, because the neighbors won't hire your hands. The church might let you kneel, but you feel the weight of the altar's gaze. The villagers whisper, not because they know something, but because silence would make it real. Talking around you is safer than talking to you, and no one speaks of the trial. Not really. Not in public. Not unless they're drunk or daring or ready to vanish next, because words are dangerous now. If you mention the judge's name, someone hears. If you criticize the priest, someone listens. And someone always repeats, so the village learns to forget, or pretends to. They bury the memory in chores and prayer. They cleanse it with distance. And you? You learn to smile when someone spits near your feet. You learn to nod when someone avoids your hand. You learn that silence is survival, that speaking of what was done to you is an invitation to have it done again. The judges remain, respected, unchallenged. They return to their estates, their dinners, their power. They speak of justice. They speak of order. They speak of God's will and civic duty. And the priests, they carry on. They bless. They chant. They pardon. They never mention the fire, the screams, the confession forced from your cracked lips. That's between you and heaven now. The church's hands are clean, washed in wine and ritual. And the executioner, he gets paid. But you carry the cost. Your name will never be clean again. Your story will never be simple again. You don't walk through the village. You haunt it. You are a reminder of how thin the line is between normal and condemned, between neighbor and witch, between a baker and a heretic, between a father and a corpse. Fear lingers. It thickens the air. Children grow up knowing not to ask too many questions. Women learn not to be too clever. Men avoid politics unless they're shouting the right words. No one talks about trials. But everyone remembers. Everyone remembers who was taken, who came back, and who didn't. The square where the pyre once stood becomes a marketplace again. But you can still see the scorch in the stone if the light is right. You can still hear the echo of prayers that ended in screams. And you sleep light. You dream hard. You tell yourself you're lucky. That others didn't come back at all, that others screamed until their lungs collapsed and their skin blistered. You got out, you survived, but survival is not peace. Survival is a sentence of its own. You wake with sweat down your spine and the phantom memory of fire licking your heels. You open your mouth to speak and hear the echo of your own forced confession. You survived, yes. But not whole, because the aftermath of a medieval trial isn't just bruises, it's legacy, it's shadow. It's the moment when the world stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a story, a caution, a question no one wants answered. You live in the margins now, between guilt and myth, between the fire and the silence that followed it. So now ask yourself, would you have survived a medieval trial? Would your silence have saved you? Would your hands have stayed steady? Your eyes dry? Your soul intact? Or would you, like so many before, have become just another name scratched onto a scroll, a mark in the ledger of a justice system that didn't care who you were, only how loud you screamed? Because in the end, it wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about truth. It was about power. And the ones who had none learned to kneel, learned to nod, and learned to pray that next time it wouldn't be their turn. But even those who didn't go to trial lived under its shadow. The threat of accusation was constant, hanging over the village like a storm that never quite broke. People censored their speech. They prayed louder, dressed more modestly, avoided certain herbs, certain books, certain people. Entire communities became theatre troupes, performing piety, obedience, and fear for each other's benefit. It wasn't about belief, it was about survival. When one person was taken, the rest clutched their rosaries and reminded themselves it could have been worse. And then they made sure it wouldn't be them next. Some accused were released not because they were believed, but because they were broken, useless, beyond fear, beyond rebellion. You might be spared the stake, but not your reputation. A returned prisoner meant whispered superstitions. She came back, but her eyes aren't right. He doesn't sleep anymore. She speaks to no one. These weren't survivors. These were reminders of what happened when you stepped out of line, when your thoughts got too loud, when you were unlucky enough to be seen. Survivors were walking ghosts. No longer one of us, but not quite one of them. Even physical space betrayed you. Many towns kept the instruments of trial and torture visible. The rack in the hall, the iron in the church vault, the execution post at the edge of the square. Not hidden, not buried, present, not as warnings to the powerful, but to the powerless. These objects were relics of pain, blessed with silence and fear, and no one ever touched them. Children were warned not to go near. Adults crossed themselves when passing, but no one dared ask why they were still there. Because to ask is to notice is to question, and questioning was a good way to get invited to a trial of your own. And it wasn't just the accused who were punished. Their families were marked. If your brother confessed to heresy, you might lose your land. If your mother was branded a witch, your future shrank to the size of a cell. Marriages were cancelled. Business deals evaporated. Friendships died. You became a contagion, unclean by association. And the more you tried to deny it, the more suspicious you became. You couldn't run from the shadow. It was stitched to your name. Even the act of witnessing a trial changed people. Children saw their first execution at 6. They heard the screaming, smelled the burning hair, watched the bodies twitch, and then went home and tried to sleep. Some became zealots, some became cruel, others became quiet, too quiet. A generation raised on justice as theatre learned one thing above all else: do not stand out. And those who enforced the system, they kept rising. The judge who ordered a dozen burnings got promoted. The priest who testified at every trial became bishop. The torturer became head of city security. Because cruelty was not a flaw, it was a qualification. The system rewarded those who made people afraid. Power was reinforced not through peace, but through punishment. And the better you were at making others tremble, the more protected you became. There were those who tried to resist, to speak out, to write letters, to gather secret groups, to question the machinery of pain. Most were never heard from again. A few escaped to distant lands. A few were burned twice, first in the square, then in history. Their names erased, their deeds forgotten, their courage reduced to rumors. And still, the system went on. Because it didn't need to be just. It only needed to be believable. Just enough ritual. Just enough scripture. Just enough ceremony to convince the masses that the blood on the altar was holy. And as long as people feared the fire more than they feared injustice, nothing would change. So again, ask yourself, would you have survived a medieval trial? Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have pointed your finger just to make the noise stop? Would you have watched your neighbor burn and said nothing? Would you have walked away from a screaming girl just to protect your own daughter? Would you have prayed louder, longer, just to make sure no one noticed the silence behind your eyes? Because in the aftermath, survival wasn't proof of innocence. It was proof of compliance, of silence, of knowing when to bow. And the scars, they were just punctuation, reminders that even if the trial ends, the sentence lasts forever. And the sentence did last forever. Not on paper, but in the air, in the soil, in the way people spoke, or more often, didn't. The town square never quite lost the smell of ash. The wooden beam where so many final breaths were taken still stood, even if no one ever mentioned it by name. You could walk by it 100 times a year and never look directly at it, because everyone knew what had happened there, knew who had died, knew who had watched, and knew who had remained silent. And the silence itself? That was the inheritance. In time, the records faded, the scrolls crumbled, The names vanished from the pages of law, but they didn't vanish from memory. They became cautionary tales, parables in the mouths of nervous parents and aging grandparents. Don't speak like that. Don't ask questions like that. Don't go near that part of the forest. And the worst part? No one remembered the details, just the fear, just the shape of the story. The edges sharpened by time, the truth warped beyond recognition. And still, no one dared correct it. There were places, entire villages, where trials had happened so often that everyone lived with one foot in history and one in denial. Where the name of the woman who was burned was no longer spoken, not because she was forgotten, but because she was remembered too clearly. Where houses sat empty because no one wanted to live on cursed ground. Where fields went untended because the soil had once soaked up blood. Where old men stared into the fire and didn't speak, not because they had nothing to say, but because they remembered saying something once and never forgot what happened after. And then there was the guilt. Not the guilt of the accused, but the guilt of the witnesses. The husbands who didn't intervene. The mothers who looked away. The friends who testified just enough to save themselves. That guilt didn't burn, it didn't bleed, it simmered, quietly, over years, until it curdled into shame, into bitterness, into superstition. Some drank, some left, some broke entirely, because living in a world where justice meant fear twisted something inside, and that twist, it passed from parent to child, not through stories, through behaviors, through flinches, through lowered eyes, through the way a whole generation learned not to trust. And what of the children who watched? What of the boys who cheered at a burning because the crowd did? What of the girls who cried when their neighbor vanished, but were told to hush, to smile, to never mention it again? They grew up into adults who built churches over execution grounds, who named streets after saints but never after victims, who built justice systems with new words but old habits, who swore never again, and then, quietly, just once more, for the right reasons, for safety, for order, because that's the trick of it. The aftermath of medieval trials wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was insidious. It lived in hesitation, in the pause before a question, in the space between thoughts. It trained people to survive, but not to live. It taught them that obedience is safer than truth, that silence is stronger than justice, that being good doesn't matter nearly as much as being invisible. And so again, for the final time, we ask, would you have survived? Would you have swallowed your questions, closed your eyes, nodded when they demanded it? Would you have smiled as the flames rose? Would you have handed over a neighbor to save a brother? Would you have spoken up when no one else did? Or would you have bowed your head, clenched your fists, and whispered the same quiet hope they all did? Let it not be me, because surviving a medieval trial wasn't about right or wrong. It wasn't about good or evil. It was about playing the game and knowing when to keep your mouth shut. And if you think you would have done better, been braver, stood taller, then maybe, just maybe, you've already forgotten how loud the silence really was.